Kingsmill Bond and his team at Ember just dropped a fantastic new paper, Rewiring the Energy Debate, the Electrotech Revolution, that we here at Energy Media agree with 100%. The argument is simple. The energy transition isn't about oil and gas or climate change. It's about electrotechnology that is lower cost, more efficient, and just flat out better. Think EVs and heat pumps as an example. And this time around, China is leading the way. The United States was behind before Donald Trump, but since he became president and began dismantling clean energy industrial policies, it's falling further and further behind. Europe is better, but not that much better. Because the West is a distant second in the race to dominate the energy of the future, we need to change the way we talk about energy, the narratives we use, and as quickly as possible. Dan Walter, the lead author on Ember's paper, and I discussed the issue in depth. Welcome to the interview, Dan.
Thank you for having me, Markham.
Look, you and your team, Kingsmill Bond and Sam Butler Sloss, but you, I guess, were the lead author. You've put out a new piece called Rewiring the Energy Debate, the Electrotech Revolution. And I have to tell you, I'm really excited about this because you see the world essentially the way we see the world. So maybe give us an overview of the paper and the argument you're making.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, it's a bit of this new piece that we put out, Rewiring the Energy Debate, is a bit of a labor of passion because we felt so frustrated with the way that the current energy debate is being held, which is basically, as we see it, a polarization between two camps. Neither of them fully get what's happening in energy. On the one hand, we have what we call the fossil gradualists, people that just think that change is going to happen slowly, that fossil fuels are basically humanity's best and cleverest invention, and it will just take a lot of time and effort to get away from fossil fuels. And on the other side, we have what we call the net zero Puritans that basically almost kind of accept this premise of the fossil side and say, yeah, but we need to suck up the costs because climate change is catastrophic and we need to avoid it at all costs. Whilst we are inherently more inclined towards the second side due to, we see the necessity on acting on climate change. We don't think that either side actually fully understands what's happening in energy right now, which is not a policy-driven shift away from emissive fuels, but a technology revolution where just more superior technologies, and in this case, technologies mostly centered around the production, transport, and use of electricity, come into the system and upend this whole the whole energy sector. And that is, I think, one of the key points that we're trying to make and try to argue that we need to kind of reframe how we think about the energy transition.
Um, Here at Energy Media, last year we developed a theory, an energy transition theory of change. And part of it is reframing the debate, and we came up with exactly the same conclusion that you did. And we call them the oil and gas folks. It's oil and gas forever. The climate side, it's the world is on fire. And for the third of the electrotech revolution, as you call it, we say the future is electric. So those are our three groups, but they're identical. And I would agree with you that, and I want to raise a point here. I read a lot of energy demand modeling, the IEA and the World Oil Outlook from OPEC, and on and on and on. And throughout all of those, policy is a key assumption. So OPEC says policy is going to get weaker because we can't afford it, and the climate is not that big a deal. And the
Mhm.
IEA says it is big a deal, and we'll see, climate policy. And what you and I would argue is that it's not policy driven anymore. It's technology driven, cost driven, market driven, and consumer driven.
100% agree, and therefore also it has the wind in its back. So I do still think policy. I think we both agree on this. Policy has a large role to play here, but it's different types of policies are now applicable to the policies of the past. It's no longer dragging cost inefficient technologies to market, hoping that someone will pick them up. It is a market that is booming. I mean, over 90% of capacity additions in the world in the power sector currently are for clean power. EVs are picking up very rapidly. This transition is kind of running on its own steam at the moment. It's kind of a self-operating, self-cleaning machine. The only thing you need to do, of course, you still can clear bottlenecks to accelerate. But it needs to start first with this realization and understanding that we've kind of crossed the tipping point, that the majority of the energy transition is locked in. The only question now is, of course, is how fast can it go? And to accelerate, you do, of course, need to understand what is actually driving change and where change actually comes from, which is one of the major points that we also make in the piece.
Yes, and you again, we agree on this point, and that is that China's driving the energy transition. And I don't think people understand to the extent to which China sees clean energy industry, both and manufacturing on both the demand side and the supply side, as part of their geopolitical strategy. China, for a couple decades now, had this greater China strategy where it sees itself as an emerging superpower, the balance to the United States in geopolitical affairs at the global level. And whereas the United States has this, enormous economy, which is the source of its geopolitical power, its military power, China sees manufacturing writ large, but high-tech industrial manufacturing specifically, and clean energy manufacturing is a huge part of that. And so they see when they talk about industrial diplomacy, we're going to go out to places like Brazil and Thailand and Bangladesh, wherever, and we're going to export our technology and we're going to help them adopt that technology. And China is remaking Asia and parts of the global south in real time. And we in North America and Europe are kind of missing it.
Yes, and missing it because I think we just like we conceived of the energy transition 20 years ago through the lens of carbon. That's how we got to know climate change, obviously, by studying the atmosphere and found CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And so we framed the whole problem as that. And so when solutions came around, like solar panels, like batteries and other things, we kept framing that as carbon mitigation solutions rather than just superior technology, which, as we see it, have three much more fundamental drivers than the lack of pollution, which is physics. It's much more efficient, Electrotech. It's economics. It is cheaper and only getting cheaper. And it is geopolitics, as you name. Every country in the world can be energy independent with Electrotech, and you can gain a lot of geopolitical independence and power from deploying these technologies. And those are three great drivers that still hold, even if climate change wasn't an issue, even if we resolved that tomorrow, we would still see all this Electrotech winning over the next decades. Now, of course, again, the pace is up for debate, but the fact that this is a superior technology that has physics, economics, and geopolitics on its side makes it very clear that this is a one-way street we're going into. And so once you start realizing strategically something is a one-way street, you know that it's about getting to the end as fast as possible. That's where how you should build up your power, and that's what China, I think, well, from what I see from China, realized already a decade or two ago, and why they went already from 2008, 5 to 2010, all in on Electrotech. And to the extent where they build overcapacity, where people in the world said, are they crazy? Why are they building so much overcapacity? Why are they already investing in battery recycling, even though batteries are not even coming offline yet? It's because they've done that maths and they've seen this momentum only gets stronger. And it's very clear that even if policy momentum fades, the intrinsics of this revolution are so strong that being first will mean you can set the world order of the 2050s.
I want to very briefly describe Energy Media's energy transition theory of change because it only has two parts. The first is imagine an S curve. Now, anybody who's in technology adoption in any way understands the S curve. But for those who don't, I'll just give a brief explanation. So a new technology starts at the bottom of the S curve over on the left-hand side of the bottom, and it works as it gets better and better and better. It works its way towards the right. Sometimes that's a decade, sometimes it's 5 decades. Depends on the technology. Then it gets to the curve of the S, and that is the inflection point where it becomes competitive with the old energy technologies. And so wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, EVs, heat pumps, all of those are now past their inflection point, and now they're getting on the hockey stick part of the growth curve. So the first 5% of the growth takes a long, long time. The next 50% takes a very short time, 10, 15, maybe 20 years. We're on that part of the curve now. And so that's the first part of our model, Dan. The second part is when your new technologies are on the growth part of the curve, they become very disruptive. They become what Professor Christensen at Harvard Business Review said called disruptive innovations. And you already see EVs and batteries disrupting the auto industry in a big, big way. What is upstream of the auto industry? The oil industry. And we're already seeing just tiny little bits of disruption starting with the super majors. And by paying attention to the pace at which those new technologies are adopted and the disruption in industries and business models, you can begin to get a sense of how fast this is going, where it's in terms of not geopolitics, but in terms of where regional, where in the world disruption is taking place faster than others. Anyway, that's our model, and I think it fits perfectly with the narrative you've laid out here.
I think it's spot on, Marco, and particularly on like once you start seeing this energy transition as a technology revolution or a disruptive technology revolution, as Christensen puts it, there's quite a lot of like actually basically middle of the road strategy theory from the 90s from Christensen that should be common knowledge right now for people to apply to this. For instance, one of the things I get very frustrated by, and I've spoken out about before, is our focus in the West on what incumbents are doing. Our focus on, oh no, BP goes back on their renewable promise, where you kind of go like, yeah, but that's kind of like going, Blockbusters is going back on their potential streaming service. Like they don't kind of get it. It's Nokia canceling their digital photography wing. It's just generally what happens. Entrants come in and incumbents try to kind of play along, but we've seen this movie so many times before, they can't quite compete. And then, and this is quite interesting, exactly what we're seeing with the BP and Shell announcements, typically, as per the Christensen model, these incumbents sort of what he calls it like flee up markets to the higher margin sectors. And that's exactly what we see because Shell and BP, what they're doing now is they're going to high margin chemicals and to higher margin products where they think they're still safe, where they think they can still make a lot of margin. And they're kind of leaving the lower margin sectors, such as, road transport and these kind of things for the disruptors to actually play in. And that is, I think, one of the critical mistakes to think that that is actually a strategy for success, because historically that's always shown to be a strategy. Like up market is where you go before you die as a company. That's kind of the Christensen story. And I think we're seeing it in oil and gas happening right now.
I say this all the time in the oil and gas community in Alberta, which is the epicenter of the Canadian industry, and I always get shocked faces in response. And I quote Christensen, and I'm paraphrasing here, but there is a long list of corporations that once were leaders that were disrupted by innovations and failed. And
Yes.
Blockbuster and Kodak, and we can think of, I mean, there's hundreds of them. And so one of the problems of incumbency is you look at these large oil and gas producers and you go, well, how could they ever fail? They'll be around forever. I mean, right? I mean, they're just too big to fail. Oh no. Oh no, they can fail. And Christensen has all kinds of case studies to show that. And I think that is part of narrative, right? It's how we think about energy. It's how we think about the industry and how we think about change. And that puts a kind of influences us to think about that, to misunderstand the pace at which change is taking place.
Exactly. The one worrisome trend, though, I have to say, to also to your point of China using Electrotech for its rise, is we've seen the story many times before. We've seen the incumbents fail. Something that we haven't seen, at least not much in modern history, is countries so desperately clinging to the incumbents that they risk failing with them. I mean, the US at the moment is an obvious example, rejecting new energy and over-indexing back on legacy fossil energy. But it's kind of a Western issue that we have at the moment with if we remain so focused on what entrants do, we'll just go down with them instead of focusing on building new companies and new organizations, hoping that one of those will be the next energy major of the 2050s. And so it doesn't matter if the oil companies go out of business. And that's, of course, different than the blockbuster stories. Like the US government or the European government didn't anchor itself to Kodak to the extent that we see current governments in the West anchoring themselves to incumbents. And that's the part that makes me nervous about what's happening in the transition, why we found it so necessary to also to put this piece out to really change the conversation, because there is a risk that what we're seeing happening right now is Christensen's disruptive transition, not just happening at a company level, but at a country level, where we see countries themselves so anchored into business, so anchored in the thinking of the old, so embedded in, as Christensen puts this, like kind of like this the old thinking, the inability to comprehend how to fit in the new in your current business models, or for a society would just be in your society, that we go down with it, and that really requires rethinking. And that is, I think, that's the jump that China has done, and a lot of countries in Asia are making that jump. And we better get on it because we do not want to be left behind in a technology transition.
There's a certain arrogance here that comes, I think, out of the West in that we have been at the top of the food chain for so long that we can't imagine somebody else being at the top of the food chain and us being maybe much further down the food chain. But one of the things that's been very clear to me over the last 5 or 6 years as I've interviewed global experts is how hungry the emerging economies are to follow the path of the West in terms of development, develop a middle class, more of a consumer society, improve everybody's lifestyle. And so you have countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia and many of the Brazil would be one in Latin America, where they see opportunity and they're leaping on it with as much gusto as they can manage, and they're finding an ally in China.
Yeah.
China sets up new plants, like electric vehicle plants. It funds infrastructure improvements, like that big port that opened up in Peru a couple of months ago that had a lot of Chinese financing in it. And China is embedding itself in the global South, which is essentially every place else but Canada, the United States, Europe, South Korea, and Japan, and Australia. And that will turn the global economy up on its head by 2050.
And it's just because China has a better deal with their energy proposition. It's not like the US isn't trying, but their proposition is LNG, which has had some reasonable success in its exports, we can say, over the past decade or so. But it's over. That is the past. You can undercut LNG energy import costs now by almost an order of magnitude through importing solar and backup batteries. And so I mean, this is kind of one of the other pieces that we're playing with is that like this idea of a battle of an overcapacity in the world right now. On the one hand, we have the US with an LNG overcapacity that's quite tremendous. On the other hand, we have China with an overcapacity of solar manufacturing sites and battery plants. And so at the moment, that is the battle in the global south. Is if you're a country in the global south, you can kind of sit back and go like, who has the best deal for me in this world of overcapacity? But then when you start looking at the details of the deal, of course, a solar panel on a battery that you can deploy in a few months and makes you independent as long as your sun keeps shining is a much sweeter deal than an LNG ship where you need to immediately commit billions of dollars. And then you're still kind of dependent on that LNG ship coming in every so many months to resupply you. And so this is I think the current battle that we're seeing playing out is kind of this overcapacity battle, and China just has the better deal.
I was having this discussion with a professor the other day and arguing that how we perceive energy security at the global level is being redefined. Energy security used to be having access to enough low cost fossil fuels, in Canada's context, that's oil and gas, and having access to it at a price that could afford, so that everybody could have warm homes and drive their cars, and all of that was energy security. Energy security is being redefined in Asia primarily through the influence of China to mean import energy technologies once,
Yes.
pay the upfront cost, and then you'll have 25 to 50 years of almost free electricity. And you don't have to then spend foreign reserves, cash reserves, buying LNG, buying oil, buying coal. You're domestically secure. And you can
Yes.
see China is absolutely the poster child for this.
Yes.
They will stick with coal as a backup in their power sector because they do not want to be importing energy. They don't want to
Yes.
be importing coal, oil, or gas by 2050, 2060. And you see lots of other countries just beginning to move in that direction. And the West still thinks of the energy security in the old way.
Yeah. Well, 100%. I think that is spot on. It's one of the in a report that we published this spring. I mean, we showed us 75% of the global population lives in a net importing country, net fossil importing country. There are countries, I think it's a quarter of the world imports for more than 5% of their GDP is spent on importing fossil fuels to burn. That's not even all they're spending, but that's just what they're importing into the country. That's a tremendous amount of money that you have to spend, and an enormous amount of insecurity. If the Strait of Hormuz or other kind of one of these choke points get cut off, what do you do as a country? I think has been the stress point for China, and they've really focused on it. It is also something as a European where I really feel like for Europe a real wake up call because China has been worried about this for about 15, 20 years now, and they're only 20% fossil import dependent. So only 20% of their primary supply of energy comes from imports. Germany is 66%. Spain is 72%. The Netherlands is something like 70%. Britain, similar number. So like if China is worried about this and if China sees risks and a chance of failure of the energy system here, Europe should definitely be on this and definitely be worried. And we're incredibly exposed to being cut off from energy. And so, I mean, Putin showed it that we need to do something about it. Now we need to double down on it.
Your paper also deals with policy. And this is fascinating because Canada just went through a federal election. We have a new prime minister, Mark Carney, and many people, he's very well known around the world as a central banker, both for Canada and the UK, the only one who's ever led central banks in two countries. And for the last decade, he's been very involved in the climate finance. So he's become like an international spokesman. Even so, Dan, even so, and this has been it amazed me when we went through the election campaign and since. Here's he never talks about the energy transition as a risk factor for future energy investments. So there's been a lot of talk in Canada, but we need more pipelines. We need to get, Canada's heavy crude out into Asian markets, China and India. And he's on board with that. He said, yeah, we're going to do that. And he's appointed an energy minister who's very, an old, I think he was the CEO of Goldman Sachs Canada. He's a deal maker, right? Tim Hodgson. And nobody ever says, where are the customers for that? Are they going to be around in 20, 25 years? Will China be around? Will China have oil demand? And they never say, let's look at not just at the opportunities, let's look at the risks associated with that. And the energy transition and the rise of electrotech displacing oil and gas is a major, major risk factor. And it doesn't even come up in conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. Have you noticed, Martin, that when people typically when you talk about the energy transition, people like to come up with this idea of system thinking. Oh, it's all about system thinking. But have you noticed that every time people come up with the concept of system thinking, they always mean today's system with today's logic, often saying how hard it is to change anything because everything is so complex. But true system thinking is exactly what you say here, is thinking not just what the system is today, but seeing how that evolves into the future, saying if all of China is going to switch to EVs and oil demand drops by, tens of millions of barrels per day, or what is it? Um, what is going to be the market dynamic? What's going to be the pricing for tar sands? Are we even going to be in business as Canada, being at the top of the cost curve of oil? And that's true system thinking. But I think the concept is often misused in terms of saying, no, this energy system is very complex. We might need another pipeline because you're not thinking systemically. It's going to take a while. Everything is interconnected. Whereas I think the true system thinking is this is a house of cards to some extent that the oil business has built over the past century. Every product supports every other product, whether it be by same corridors with pipelines, same refineries that create a mix of products. Once you start pulling Jenga pieces out of this tower, I'm now mixing up metaphors with my, once you start pulling Jenga pieces out, this tower is getting less and less stable until you will get, I think, as you put it, also like just a collapse and a deflation of this whole sector. And I think we are underappreciating how close we are to that tipping point. We see it now with this great article from Carbon Brief on the tipping point of emissions in China. We might see fossil fuels peaking this year or next year because with China the world turns. They're such a huge market that them peaking means the whole world will likely peak. That will just send the like shockwaves through the whole fossil market. And I'd be very curious to see what kind of risk assessments are done on $40 or $30 per barrel oil prices in these kind of projects, or what kind of assessment is done by investment banks on what's the profitability of a driller if you don't need more oil. That's very, very low unless they have a geothermal play. And I think it's a very much a lacking in our debate today, is sort of true, not incumbent today system thinking, but system thinking into the future.
Let me use Canada to illustrate this, because Canada at the moment has one of the best power grids in the world. It's anchored by 60% hydro, 17% nuclear. So already you've got dispatchable power, clean dispatchable power, making up 3/4 of your grid. And then it has 7 or 8% wind and solar. And so already you've got low costs. We have one of the lowest cost grids. It's reliable and it's clean. And I've been arguing for a long time that that is the competitive advantage. That is an enormous competitive advantage in an electrotech revolution.
Yes.
And you could take competitive advantage, and you could leverage it into all kinds of things. Like I advocate turning oil sands bitumen into materials instead of sending it to a refinery, and use clean electricity to power all of the supply chain as well as the manufacturing plants. That would be enormous competitive advantage instead of sending a barrel off and making a few bucks per barrel because you sent it to the U.S. Gulf Coast. And the point I'm getting at here is that Canada is so locked into a particular system and way of thinking that it can't break out and go, hey, you know what? We already have this advantage over here. What other opportunities could we take advantage of that we've never been able to do before? We've been locked into a hewers of wood and drawers of water. Now we can make a leap forward, almost in a way like an emerging economy would, and people just turn off their ears. They don't even want to hear it.
It's a shocking fact when you look at so electricity supply, indeed, in Canada, very clean. We're seeing in the rest of the world slowly catching up. That's a supply side story, but this transition is, of course, as most of these big supply and demand story. On the demand side, on a demand for electricity, we actually see across the West, across the EU, across North America, a stagnation in electrification since somewhere around 2008, and Canada is also part of that. And so, whilst Canada has very cheap power, the next step, really the unlock to make people in Canada feel what you can do with that cheap power, is electrify, is make sure that you can drive an EV so you can experience that driving doesn't need to be expensive. That you can put a heat pump in place, in Canada, probably one of those cold climate heat pumps in place, so you can experience what it is not to have to pay extraneous gas bills at the end of the month. And so that is, I think, one of the misconnects in our policy making at the moment, is that we're very focused on the supply side and making sure that we get lots of renewables deployed. And I think that's a very good idea to do, obviously, because renewables are now cheaper and it's the future. And so we need to push this. But at the same time, to make your constituents feel the benefit of that, how much for you and I does it matter if our wholesale electricity price and our bill goes down by 20%? Like, that's a huge amount, and that's roughly what renewables can probably do for us. But what does that really mean on my bill, that my computer that I run is going to be 20% less expensive to run? I don't feel that. But what I do feel is that my car is electric and my house is heated with a heat pump. That I can literally feel, not just in cost and in what I need to spend, but also in quality of life. My quality of life goes up with a better car, with a better heating system. And I think this is one of the forgotten vectors of the energy transition, is electrification. We focus so much on renewables that we kind of forgot that only through electrification can we get the benefits of renewables into the homes of constituents.
That's a very, very good point. And one of the things that China has done, and I think this is the key, one of the keys to it, the success of its clean energy industrial policies, is that when it began to expanding solar and wind and EVs and batteries, 2005, 2008, it didn't just focus on supply, it focused on demand as well. And China has such a large domestic market that it could stimulate the demand for what they call new energy vehicles and heat pumps and all of these other technologies, so that the manufacturing plants that it was supporting over here would have customers over here. And that's allowed them, why did they scale? Well, they still have lots of room. There is no, the Chinese market is not saturated by any stretch in any of those technologies. And and I also made this argument last year when Biden put on the 100% Chinese EV tariffs. Uh, all it did was China just went, oh, okay, we can't get in the U.S. We'll just go over here to the global south. No problem.
Yeah.
So long.
Can I tell you a
And
story, Mark? I was speaking to a senior director from one of the large Chinese car companies at a conference, and we were creating this report on comparing the Chinese states to Chinese provinces to American states and EU member states. And so it's kind of hard to find detailed data on China and market sizes and EV uptake because it's all kind of murky to find that data. So I asked him, where can I find data? Because we want to create like a market report to show where the market size is. And his answer was basically, yeah, Dan, it's a bit of a Western obsession to hire data scientists to scout out where to sell. What we do is we hire data scientists and we improve what we sell. And we believe if the product is better, there'll always be people willing to spend money on it. And I thought that was an interesting look into the way that the Chinese industrial complex at the moment is thinking about this growth. They're growing to the extent where they can't even spare data scientists to look into detail where in China they can sell because it's just more important to get them to improve the product and make that better. And I think that was quite an interesting insight into the psyche of this growth. It's really focused on making better and better products, less focused on just smarter and smarter selling, which seems to be more of a Western approach at the moment.
and it's funny how we perceive that because not many Canadians have connections to China and or who understand what's going on. And so we tend to think of China, like if I bring that up in conversation or during an interview, I often get, well, yeah, but they burn a lot of coal. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Or they have human rights abuses, or they employ slave labor, all of which is true and deplorable. But that's not the
Yes.
context in which we're having the conversation. And
Exactly, Marco. Yes.
using those kind of moral arguments to simply dismiss your competition. See, this is a thing that the oil and gas industry doesn't understand, and the auto industry is late to understand. And Michael Dunn, who's a former GM executive in Indonesia, comes on here. We talk about this all the time. He said, "Markham, I was there." He said, all through the 2010s, we kept hearing how China was, car industry was going to expand and explode and take off. It never happened. And all the domestics, like all the legacy automakers, just got kind of fat and happy and that's never going to happen. And then 2018, 2019 came along and they were absolutely caught off guard. Just, and you can see today, they still haven't got a China strategy that works. They're all losing market share. And
Yes.
that to me is a metaphor for every other industry. When we look at China, we don't understand our competition.
Yes.
In a capitalist society, in a free, supposedly free market, populated by some of the smartest business minds on the planet's ever produced, and they
Well,
don't understand their
we don't understand
competition.
the competition, and we make a category error thinking of new energy tech as clean tech, right? That's the bundle
Yeah.
under which we put it. And so when you call clean tech, it immediately triggers in people's brains sort of this the moral side of the debate, and so they come back with human rights abuses and a lot of coal use, which are both true, both bad, and both something one should do something about it. But as you put it, seeing the energy transition as an electrotech revolution means that it's a different category. We're talking about a technology race. When we talk about advances in AI, It's also not like, oh yeah, deep sea came out, but did you know they used a lot of, I don't know, coal to train this model? Or did you know that they didn't treat their employees right when they did it? No, we realized that with AI, it's about winning. It's about getting it right. And it's about being at the forefront. But somehow when it goes to energy, and that's particularly because in the West, we have framed it as clean energy, that we keep going back, constantly having moral debates. And I think even though those debates are important to have, they're actually at the moment not actually irrelevant to the future of electrotech. They're actually driven by China for much deeper drivers. I mean, as we put it, the physics, the economics, and the geopolitics that come, the benefits that come with electrotech, rather than the morals. And so that's, I think, a large part of this disconnect. And I fully agree. This idea of a lot of coal use in China, human rights abuses, are sit in a different category, which is a moral judgment on whether a country is doing well by the world, rather than a technocratic judgment. Are they winning? And on the latter, it is 100% yes. On the former, we can have moral debates, but there are different categories, and this is part of what we fundamentally argue, and I think we're in agreement on, is whilst we should continue to have the discussions on morality for sure, we shouldn't be blind to the technocratic discussion on actually winning this thing, because there's way too much danger. I mean, the war in Ukraine with drone warfare and electric warfare and the electrification of warfare that we're seeing across the world happening, it's just too dangerous to lose that battle. And we shouldn't let morals there be a distraction from the technocratic truth that is going on. Both should be practiced, but the latter should probably be dominant.
One of the, Blockbuster has become a metaphor for, basically not seeing your competition coming. But the truth is that in 2006, Netflix came to Blockbuster and said, "We'd like to sell our company to you for $50 million." And so the Blockbuster executives, they looked at the deal and turned it over, and then they said no, because we don't think that this model will ever take off. Whether it was maybe the homes, the average home won't have bandwidth, for example, to stream video. You can't make any money at it, that sort of thing. They didn't look down the road and see that storage was going to be really cheap, and that the telecom revolution would make internet access really cheap, et cetera, et cetera. And so they said no to the company that eventually ate their lunch and put them into bankruptcy. And the point here is we should not take the word of, or the analysis, of oil and gas CEOs, or utilities CEOs who are used to coal and gas, that sort of thing, as if they know what they're talking about, because all they know is the old system, not the emerging system. They know the old style of competition, not the new style of competition. And that has a lot to do with why we're locked into this old style debate, and why a paper like yours is so important.
And another category error, I would say, of thinking of new energy tech as something that is like comparable to barrels of oil and LNG ships. Whilst in reality, when you look at these technologies, there's much more in common between a laptop and a solar panel than between a solar panel and a barrel of oil, right? Or a gas power plant, if we want to compare technologies. So really who we should be listening to if we want to hear how good is China at manufacturing these new energy technologies is much more the tech sector than it would be other oil or fossil players. And what do we hear those tech players saying? My lord, we cannot afford losing manufacturing in China because they're just too good at what they're doing. Between the automation, cost reduction, and skills that they can enact, we cannot compete. And so this is, I think, another mistake, is that we think of new energy as a continuation of it's just a new kind of barrel of oil. But in reality, as we frame it, Electrotech is to some extent the child of the IT revolution. Much of Electrotech actually came from innovations in the digital and hardware tech revolution in China, as the new book, this Apple in China, which is a very fascinating book I'm reading at the moment, shows actually a lot of Chinese know-how created by Apple as they came over and taught people how to make smartphones and this kind of stuff. Trained millions of people in China how to do this. And a lot of those innovations spilled into the energy space, into solar panels, into, of course, batteries and other technologies. And that's why you now see such a huge momentum, is because China can just reshape semiconductor factories into solar panel factories. That's not that big of a shift. And that's part of where this momentum of new energy currently comes from Electrotech comes from. It's not entirely new. It doesn't start from zero. It's actually a continuation of the hardware that supported our digital revolution over the past 20, 25 years.
I was twigged to this argument by a fellow named Mike Andrade, who is the CEO of Morgan Solar in Toronto. And he's been in the electronics manufacturing game for 30 years. In fact, he set up factories in China 20 years ago. And his point was, and there's a podcast you can find it on our old podcast, Energy Talks, where he talks about how energy as a technology is fundamentally different than energy as a commodity. And he said, look, when you go to China, there's a couple of things you quickly realize. One is how good they are at manufacturing. They've been manufacturing smartphones and other kinds of electronic equipment for a long time, and they've taken that expertise and applied it to solar panels and wind turbines and whatever. They're really good at it. They do it at scale, and they do it with robots and precision that we have a hard time meeting. The second thing is their supply chains. Over the course of the becoming dominant in electronics and putting like Japanese companies almost out of business and so on. In the course of that, they've developed these supply chains around batteries and processing and skills, pools of engineers, that kind of thing, that then just logically flowed into these other electrotechs.
Mm-hmm.
And that all acted to propel the Electrotech revolution at a speed that we just couldn't imagine. Back at you and I are old enough to remember back in the internet boom when we used to talk at the speed of internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Internet speed, internet time. Now we talk about China time, China
China.
speed, because it's so much faster, and we are just fundamentally intellectually not plugged into what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, a fun data point for your viewers here as well. I think so. One of the things that recently has become very clear is that this whole myth of China being so far ahead because they have lower labor costs is indeed very much a myth, because the automation in the manufacturing sector in China is stunning. I think we're now seeing these articles coming out of dark factories, right, where the lights don't even go on because it's just machineries, just pieces of machinery working. And maybe once a day they turn the lights on for an engineer to walk through, see everything is okay, lights go off, and it continues to work 24/7. In the battery sector, per gigawatt hour of batteries, in China, you need, I believe it's like 50 FTE per gigawatt hour produced, so 50 people per gigawatt hour. Whilst in the West, it's about 300 or 350 FTE per gigawatt hour. No wonder we can't compete. It's not just because our labor costs are higher, but we need about 7 times more people to make the same battery. And I think that's another component where I think we have a bit of a Western street light and maybe even a Western arrogance when we look at China, where we go, oh, I'm sure the only reason they're cheaper is because they don't pay their people. Even if they would pay their people as much as you would pay people in Europe, it would still be much more competitive to manufacture in China. And we need to accept that fact and not be so simplistic in saying we need to compete. The only way to compete with China is just lower labor costs.
Let's wrap up the interview this way, Dan. In a few hours, I'm going to be interviewing Professor David G. Victor from the University of California. And his argument, he wrote a foreign policy article, which basically argues that Trump is killing innovation. And over since 2021, when Biden came in and brought in all of the clean energy, the Electrotech industrial policy, I've had many, many American entrepreneurs come on, who are involved in innovating heat batteries or some other, kind of tech. And I always make a point of asking them, uh, do you think that America's superior and much larger innovation ecosystem will eventually allow the United States to catch up and pass China's ability to do things at scale? And they all were very optimistic about that. They said, yeah, give us the time. This is a long, and you and Kingsmill have made this argument. It's a long race. And
Yes.
America's competitive advantages was that innovation ecosystem. And David G. Victor is going to argue that Trump is dismantling it. And so the
Yes.
very thing that the United States needs to catch up and be competitive on the global market, Donald Trump is taking a sledgehammer to it.
Yes, and innovation and foreign students coming in, foreign knowledge. Um, uh, I mean, yes, will it take a sledgehammer to the energy transition in the US? This policy, yes, but the world remains to be seen. Typically, these scientists are flexible. They live for the work, as many of us do in this sector. And if Europe can pass a smart policy to attract, for instance, what happened seemed to have happened yesterday with Chinese students getting en masse rejected and visas revoked. If the EU is smart, or Canada, or Mexico, or any of the other advanced nations that tries to get ahead, they'll just blanket invite these people to come to their universities and continue their research there. It will be a hurdle. It's of course it's not helpful, but this transition is way too fundamental, and the drivers are way too strong to actually have one administration of one country that is deliberately making itself less relevant in the world be able to stop this. So a dent surely for the US energy transition, but I think but a wrinkle for the global energy transition in the end.
Dan, I want to have you back for more of these kinds of conversations because we can't get our arms around the problem in one conversation. We need many more, and there's so many more wrinkles to this, so many more ideas that need to be expanded and discussed. And so, viewers, stay tuned. I know Dan loves to talk about this stuff as I do, so I'm sure I'm not going to have to twist his arm to get him back. Will I, Dan? You'll come back, won't
Definitely
you?
not. I'd be more than happy to come back.
Great. We'll look forward to it. Thank you very much for this.